In this video, I will show you how to create an ASP.NET Core Web API using Visual Studio 2022. So I will show you how to create a new project using .NET 7, and we will explore the structure of this project. Then we will see how to create an API controller and the actions that will handle the different HTTP requests and methods. We will see how to return a specific type and also how to return different HTTP responses using IActionResult. Then we will use a model class to transmit the data between the server and the client. And finally, I will show you how to make data validation and custom validation. Now let's create a new ASP.NET Core Web API. So let's click on Create a new project. In this window, we can select C#, then All Platforms, and here we can select Web. Then we need to select this option. It is ASP.NET Core Web API. So if you cannot find this option, then we need to scroll down. Then we have to click on Install More Tools and Features. Then in this window, we have to select this option. It is ASP.NET and Web Development. Then we have to click on the Install button. But in my case, it is already installed. So let's close this window. And here we have to select ASP.NET Core Web API. So let's select it. Then let's click on Next. Then let's call this project Web Store API. So it will be saved at this location. Of course, it is possible to change it. And now let's click on Next. In this window, we have to select the version of .NET. So let's select .NET 7, which is the latest version. For the authentication type, let's select None. Let's check this box to use HTTPS. Then we need to check this box to use controllers. And finally, let's check this box because we want to use Swagger to test our API. Now let's click on Create. Now the project has been created, so we can close this page. And here we can see that in the controllers folder, we have this controller. It is called Weather Forecast Controller. Let's open it. So in this controller, we can see that we have this attribute, API controller. This means that this controller is an API controller and does not respect the conventions of the MVC controller. Also, we have this attribute, route. So here we can see that we have controller between brackets. This means that this controller is accessible at the URL that contains the name of the controller without the controller word. So this controller will be accessible at the URL that contains weather forecast. Now if we scroll down, we can see that we have this method. So this method is accessible using the HTTP GET method. And it will return a list of weather forecast objects. So we can find weather forecast class in the solution just here. So let's open this file. And we can see that it is a model that contains these properties. Now let's test the application. So we can click on this Run button, or also we can use this button to start the application without debugging. So let's click on this button. And because we are using a self-signed certificate to use the HTTPS, we have this warning. So let's click on Advanced. And let's click on this button, Accept the risk and Continue. In this page, we can see that we are using Swagger, which is available on the local machine at this port number. And also it is available at this URL, /swagger/index.html. Also, we can see here that we have the name of our controller, which is our endpoint. So it is weather forecast without the controller word. Then we can use the HTTP GET method to receive the data from the server. So here let's click on this list. So here we can see that we don't need to provide any parameters to send a request to the server. Also, the response can be of type 200, which means a success response. Then the data that we can receive is a list of objects. And the objects here are of type weather forecast, which is the model that we are using inside the controller. Now to send a request to the server, we can click on Try it now. Then let's click on Execute. So here we can see that the request has been transmitted to this URL and we received this data. So here we have a list of objects and we have 5 objects. Now let's update the controller to send 10 objects instead of 5. So here we have to update the get method and we have to change this parameter. So let's write 10. Now let's save the file, and to restart the application we can either use this button or also we can use the hot reload feature. So let's click on this button. Let's go back to the browser. So let's click on this list, then try it out, then execute. And this time we have 10 objects in the response. So instead of clicking on the hot reload button each time we make a modification, we can enable the automatic hot reload. So let's go to Visual Studio, and here let's click on this button. Then let's select hot reload on file save. So now let's change this value and let's write 9. Let's save the file. And here we can see that the modifications have been applied. So let's display 5 instead of 9. Let's save the file. And the modifications have been applied again. Let's go to the browser. Let's click on this list, then try it out. Then execute. And this time we have 5 objects. So here we can see that the server is running on this poor number. And of course it is possible that we need to change it. So later I will show you how to change this poor number. So this is the structure of our project. And we can open this solution. So let's make double click on it. So in this file we can see that we are using version 7 of .NET. And here we have the list of packages which are already installed inside this project. Then we have the folder called Properties. Let's expand it, and it contains the launch settings file. So let's open it. So this file contains the configuration of the different profiles of this project. So we can see that we have the HTTP profile and also we have the HTTPS profile. Then we have this profile, IIS Express. So these profiles are what we have when we click on this button. So here we have HTTP, HTTPS which is already selected, and IIS Express. So now I will show you how to update this profile. So we have just to update this profile. Let's call it Web API. So this name should appear in this list when we save the file. Now let's update the port number of this application. So for the moment it is using this port number, and for example let's change it and let's write 4000. Now let's save this file. So let's click on this button and let's select this profile, Web API. Now let's run the application. And now we can see that our Web API is available on the port number 4000. The next file that we have here is this one. It is appsettings.json. So let's open it. This file is useful to add some configuration parameters that allow us to configure our application. So for example, we can add the connection string that allows us to connect to the database. Also, we can add some API keys that allows our Web API to connect to other Web APIs. And of course, it is possible to add any type of parameters such as the application name. The next file inside this project is this one, which is Program.cs. This file is the principal file of this application. It allows us to configure the application and is executed only one time when we start the application. Then we can add services to this application. So a service is a class that can be used by the different classes of the application. And we can add it inside the service container. Like this, it will be available to the different classes of this application. And then we can use the dependency injection to inject the service to the constructor of the different classes of this application. Then here we can configure the pipeline of the application. So the pipeline is a sequence of middlewares and filters which are executed sequentially before and after the execution of the controller. So here we can see that when we receive a request, it will enter to the pipeline, which is a set of middlewares, and the last middleware will execute several filters and then will execute the controller. And then when we have a response, the response will be also processed by the different middlewares and then will be transmitted to the client. So here we can see that the middlewares are executed in a well-defined order. And if we have any custom middleware, it will be executed just between the authorization middleware and the endpoint middleware. Now let's delete this controller and let's create our own controller. Let's delete this model as well. And now let's create a new API controller inside the controllers folder. So let's make a right click, then add, then controller. In this window, let's select API, then API controller empty, then add. Then here let's select API controller empty and let's call it userscontroller.cs. So this controller will be available at the URL API / the name of the controller, which is users. Of course, we can change this URL. Also, we have this attribute because this is an API controller. Now let's create the different methods that will process the different HTTP requests. So first, let's create a global variable of type list that will contain the list of users. So just here we can create it. It can be private or public. So let's create it as a private variable. And it should be static. Like this, it will save the data over the different requests. So it is static. And it is a list of string values. Let's call it list users. And let's initialize it. So we can fill it with some data. So the data is of type string. So here let's add some string values. Then let's create the method that will return the list of users. So this method will be accessible using the HTTP get method. So here we have to add the HTTP get attribute. Then we have to define the method. So it should be public. It will return a list of string values. And let's call it get users. So we don't need to provide any parameter. And we need just to return the list of users. Now let's create another method that will return only one user identified by its ID. So we can copy the first method. Let's paste it here. So let's call it getUser. And we need the ID of the user. So here let's add a parameter called ID. And to access to this method, we have to add the ID of the user to the route. So we can do it using this attribute. So here between parentheses, we have to add double quotes. Then between brackets, we have to add the ID of the user. So the name of this parameter should be the same as the name of this variable. And then we have to return the user having this ID. So the type of the return will be string. And we will return the user having this ID. So here we have to add between brackets the ID of the user. But before returning this user, we have to check that this ID is valid. So just here, let's add a condition. So if the ID is valid, then we will return the user having this ID. Otherwise, we will return an empty string. Now let's create another method that allows us to add a user to this list. So the new method should be available using the HTTP post method. So just here we have to add the attribute HTTP post. Then let's create the method. So it returns nothing, so it returns void, and let's call it add user. So this method requires as a parameter the name of the user, which is of type string. Let's call it username. And then what we have to do is to add this user to this list. Now let's create another method that allows us to update a user. So the new method should be available using the HTTP put method. So just here we have to add HTTP put. Then let's create the new method. So it is a public method that does not return anything, and let's call it update user. So here we need the ID of the user, and also we need the username. We can read the ID of the user from the route. So just here we have to add parentheses, then double quotes, and then between brackets we have to add the ID of the user. So the ID that we will have inside the route will be the ID of the user that we want to update. Then we need to read the username from the body of the request. So what we have to do here is to update the user having this ID. So first let's check if the ID is valid or not. So if the ID is valid, then we will update the user having this ID. Finally, let's create the method that will be executed when we receive an HTTP delete request. So we have to add the attribute HTTP delete. And then we have to add the ID of the user in the URL. So between parentheses, we have to add double quotes. Then between brackets, we have to add the ID of the user. Now let's create the method. So it is a public method of type void. And let's call it delete user. So we need the ID of the user that we want to delete. And we can find the ID in the route. So here we have to check if the ID is valid or not. So we can copy this code. If the ID is valid, then we can delete the user having this ID from this list. Let's save the file and let's run the application. So here we can see that we have the name of the new controller without the controller word. And also we have the list of HTTP methods that we can use. So first, let's see the list of users that we have. So let's click on this list. Let's click on try it out, then execute. And here we can see that we have a list of 4 string values. Now let's create a new user. So let's use the post method. Here let's click on try it out, and then let's provide a name. Then execute. So here we can see that the response is 200, which means a success response. And the response is empty, it has no data. This is because the action that served the request returns void, so it does not return any data. Now let's check that the new user has been added. So let's click on the first list. Then here we can see that previously we have 4 users. So let's click on execute. And now we have this new user. So this user is the last user of this list. So it has the ID 4. Now let's find this user by ID. So we can use the get method that requires the ID of the user. Let's click on try it out. Then let's provide the ID 4. Let's click on execute. And we have this user. Now let's try to provide an ID which is not valid, for example 40. Then let's click on execute. So here we can see that we still have the response 200, which means success response, but this time we have no data. Now let's try to update a user. So let's click on this list. Let's click on try it out. And let's update the last user with ID 4. So we have to provide the new username. Let's write Michael, for example. Let's click on execute. So here we have a success response with no data. Then let's use the first route, which allows us to read all the users. So initially the last user has this name, Patrick, and because we updated the name, we should find Michael when we click on execute. So let's click on execute. And here we can see that the last user is now called Michael. Now let's delete a user. So let's click on this list. And let's delete the last user. So here let's write 4. Let's click on execute. So here we have a success response with no data. And when we click on execute, this last user should be deleted. So here we can see that we have only 4 users. Now instead of returning a specific type, we can return IActionResult. This allows us to return different responses to the client. So let's delete this type. Let's write IActionResult. Then let's check if this list contains data or not. So if this list is not empty, then we can return the data of this list. So we have to write return OK of list users. Otherwise, we can return no content. Then let's do the same thing with the get user. So let's delete string. Let's write IActionResult. And if the ID is valid, then we will return this user. So let's write OK. Then the user. Otherwise, we will return not found. Let's do the same thing with this action. So instead of void, let's write IActionResult. And after adding the new user to the list, we can return OK. Now let's update this action. So here let's delete void. Let's write IActionResult. And after updating the user, we can return OK. So OK means that we will return the response code 200, which is a success response. Now for this method, we have to do the same thing. So let's delete void. Let's add IActionResult. And when we delete a user, we can just return no content. Let's save the file and let's test the application. Let's read a user by its ID. So let's click on this list. Let's click on try it out. Then let's provide a valid ID, 1 for example. Let's click on execute. So here we have a success response with the name of this user. Now let's try to provide the ID which is not valid. For example, let's provide 10. Let's click on execute. So here we have this response, which means that the user is not found. Let's take a look on the action. And we can see that get user by ID will return not found if the ID is not valid. Now let's delete a user. Let's provide any ID, 1 for example. Let's click on execute. So here we have a success response with no data. We can see that the delete user action returns no content. Now, instead of using a simple data type, which is string in our case, we can use models. So let's create a new folder inside this application. Let's call it models. Then we need to create a new model to store the data of the users. This model will be used to store the data exchanged between the client and the server. So it is called Data Transfer Object Model or DTO Model. So here let's make a right click on models, then add, then class, and let's call it user DTO. Then let's create the different properties that will store the details of the user. So they should be public. So the first property is of type string and it is called first name. Let's initialize it with an empty value. Then let's create another property called last name and let's initialize it. Then let's create the email property. Then let's create phone. And finally, let's create the address property. Let's save the file. Then let's change the type of this list. So instead of string, let's write user DTO. So here we can see that we have this error. This is because we need to add the namespace. So let's select it. And also let's write user DTO just here. Let's delete these values. And let's create a new user DTO object. Then between these brackets we can define the values of the different properties of this class. So first we have the first name. Then let's provide a value for the last name. Then we have the email address, then phone, and finally we have the address. Then let's create a new user inside this list. So we can copy this user. Let's add comma. And let's paste this user. So let's change the first name. Also let's change the last name. And let's change the email address. Let's update the phone number. And we can keep the address as it is. So here we don't need to update this method or this method. And in the add user method, we need to update this parameter. So it will not be of type string. So let's delete this type. Let's add user DTO. And let's call it user. And let's add this user inside this list. Then let's update the update user method. So here we can update this parameter. It will be of type user DTO. Let's call it user. So this method allows us to update a user, and this is the new user. So we have to replace this variable with user. And here we can see that we don't need to update the delete user method. Now let's save the file and let's test the application. Now we can see that we have a new type under schemas. So this is the new model that we have created. We can expand it And we can see that we have the first name, the last name, the email, the phone number, and the address. So here we can see that every string in this model can be null. Now let's see the list of users. Let's click on execute. So here we can see that we have a list of 2 users. Now let's create a new user. So let's click on this list, try it out. And here we have to provide the first name, the last name, the email, the phone, and the address. So let's delete this value and let's provide a valid value. Let's do the same thing with the other parameters. Then let's click on execute. And here we have a response 200, which means a successful response. Let's take a look on the list of users, execute, and this time we have 3 users. Now let's update the last user. So let's click on this list. So the last user has the ID 2. And here let's provide the new values. Let's click on execute. So here we have a successful response. Now let's take a look on the list of users. Execute. And here we can see that the email address, the phone number, and the address have been updated. Now I will show you how to make data validation when we submit the data to the server. So let's go to our model, which is available in the models folder, which is user DTO. And here we need to add validation attributes. So the first name is required, so we have to decorate it using the required attribute. So between brackets we have to add required. And here we can see that we have an error. This is because we have to add the data annotations namespace. Also the last name is required, so let's copy this attribute and let's add it above last name. Then we can customize the error message if we don't have the last name. So here between parentheses we can add error message, and then we have to provide a string which is the error message. So here we will use the default error message for the first name if the first name is missing, but we will use this custom error message with the last name. Now let's decorate the email property. So it is required, and also it should have the email format. So we can add another attribute. It is called email address. So we can add the 2 attributes on different lines, or also we can add them on the same line separated with comma, just like this. Then let's suppose that the phone number is optional, so we will not decorate it using any attribute. And finally the address is required, so here let's add required. And also we can define a minimum length and a maximum length to the address. So we can use additional validation attributes, which are min length and max length. So the minimum length is 5 characters, and if we did not respect this constraint, then we can display the error message. The address should be at least 5 characters. And the maximum length is 1000 characters, and if we did not respect this constraint, then this is the error message. So this is all what we have to do to implement the data validation, because the controller will take care to verify the validation attributes when we submit a user to the server. So let's save this file and let's test the application. Let's expand user DTO. And here we can see that we have some constraints. So for example, for the address, it should have a minimum length equal to 5 and a maximum length equal to 1000. Also, the email property is of type email address. Now let's create a new user. So let's click on the post list. So let's provide an empty first name. Let's also clear the last name. And let's provide an email address which is not valid. And finally, for the address, we can keep it empty. Let's click on execute. And here we have the validation errors for the different properties. So the email address should be a valid email address. The address is required and also it should be at least 5 characters. Then here we have for the last name, please provide your last name, which is our custom error message. But for the first name, the error message is the first name field is required, which is the default error message. Now let's provide valid values. Let's click on execute. So this time we have a success response with no data. Now let's update a user. So the update action requires a user DTO object. That's why the validation will be also applied for the put method. So let's click on this list. Let's provide the ID of the user that we want to update. So let's update the last user with ID 2. And let's provide empty values. Let's provide an email address which is not valid. And let's provide a short address. Let's click on execute. So here we can see that we have an error message with the email, with the address, with the last name, and also with the first name. Now let's provide valid values. Let's click on execute. So this time we have a success response. Now I will show you how to add custom validation errors. For example, let's check that the email address is authorized. So let's go to the add user method that allows us to create a new user, and just at the beginning of this method, let's check that the email address is authorized. So for the moment, let's add a comment. So in our case, we will check that the email address is not equal to user@example.com. So if the email address of the user is equal to this value, then we can display a custom error message to the user and we can return bad request. So here we have to add model state.addModelError. This is the name of the property that has an error, and this is the custom error message. And of course, we will return bad request with the model state. Now let's do the same thing when we update a user. So let's copy all of this. Let's go to the update user method, and just at the beginning we can paste the code. Let's save the file and let's test the application. Let's create a new user. So here let's keep this email address which is not authorized, and let's click on execute. And here we have our custom error message. So it is an error message for the email address, and this is the error message. Also, we can see that the response is of type bad request.